My name is Alara Whitmore, and the night the federal agents walked into my husband's charity gala and called his name, I did not look surprised. I looked prepared. But that moment did not begin at the gala. It began 8 months earlier when my husband came home trembling, holding a medical folder against his chest like it was a death sentence. "Laura," he whispered, sitting at the edge of our bed. "They found something." That was how it started. We had been married 10 years. 10 years of predictable mornings. Coffee at 6:45. His tie slightly crooked my habit of straightening it. Weekend grocery lists. Shared Netflix passwords. Familiar arguments about whose turn it was to call the plumber. Nothing dramatic. Nothing explosive. Just normal. Which is why I believed him. He placed the folder in my hands. Inside were scan images, lab numbers, medical terminology I did not fully understand. Words like irregular growth. Further investigation. Biopsy recommended. I felt the air leave my body. "What do we do?" I asked. He swallowed. "They need to run more tests. It's complicated." Complicated. That word would follow me for months. The hospital visits began immediately. He insisted on going alone at first. "It's better if I handle the consultations," he said gently. "I don't want you sitting in sterile rooms all day." He framed it like protection. I framed it like love. Within weeks, medical bills started arriving. Insurance covered a portion. The rest fell on us, then on me. I transferred from savings, then from investments. Then, I liquidated a certificate account I had built since my 20s. He cried the night I sold my grandmother's gold bracelet. "I don't deserve you," he said, voice shaking. He was right, but not for the reason. He thought month 3, he became distant, not cold, distant. He kept his phone face down. He started stepping outside to take calls. He created a separate email for medical updates. He said that doctors were considering advanced monitoring. He needed to stay overnight occasionally. The hospital suite looked more like a boutique hotel room than a recovery ward. Private bathroom, sofa, television, soft lighting. "It's for immune protection," he explained. I nodded. Fear makes you accept things you would normally question. Month 5, I began noticing patterns. He was always admitted on alternating weeks, Monday to Wednesday, never weekends. He discouraged me from visiting during certain hours. "Fatigue hits hard in the evenings," he said. "I don't want you seeing me like that." But once, I arrived early. He wasn't there. The nurse said he had stepped out for imaging. 2 hours later, he returned through the lobby elevator, not the medical wing. He looked surprised to see me. "You should have called," he said quickly. I apologized. Month 6. The money was nearly gone. I took on extra consulting, work at night. I slept for hours. I learned medical vocabulary. I joined online support forums for spouses of critically ill partners. He became more affectionate on days when invoices arrived, more fragile when I asked questions. He started talking about legacy planning. "If something happens," he would say, holding my hand dramatically, "promise you'll be okay." I would silence him with tears. The performance was flawless, until the day it cracked. Month 8, I walked into the hospital lobby, carrying the largest payment yet, $43,000. Final stage extended care. The receptionist smiled politely. "You're here for Mr. Daniel Whitmore." "Yes," she typed something. Paused up, double quotes. "Oh, his wife is already upstairs." The sentence landed softly, but it echoed violently. "I'm sorry," I asked. She glanced at the screen. "Room 417. She checked in 20 minutes ago." She, not you. Not Mrs. Whitmore. She. I felt strangely calm. "Thank you," I said. I took the elevator up. Room 417's door was slightly open. I heard laughter. Soft, intimate. Not the laughter of a dying man, the laughter of a relaxed one. I pushed the door gently, and there he was, sitting upright, healthy, taller, in his face. Across from him sat a woman I had never seen before. Early 30s, elegant, confident. She leaned forward and kissed him, not cautiously, not guiltily, comfortably. He saw me first. His smile disappeared instantly. She followed his gaze, and then the silence swallowed the room. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. "Don't stop on my account," I said calmly. The woman stood up quickly. I'm sorry, are you his wife?" I asked her directly. She looked confused. "He told me you left." "Interesting." I looked at Daniel. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. "Explain," I said. He tried to speak, failed, tried. Again. "It's not what it looks like." I almost laughed. "It looks like you're healthy," I replied. That was when the real crack appeared in his face. Not guilt, fear, because the lie was no longer about infidelity. It was about money. The nurse entered with a clipboard. "Oh," she said awkwardly, sensing tension. "Could I see his medical chart?" I asked. Donald immediately shook his head. "That's confidential." "Yes," I said evenly. "It is." The nurse hesitated, then handed it to me. There were no oncology notes, no biopsy confirmations, no treatment schedules, just general wellness. Evaluations. Stress-related symptoms. Routine labs. Observation. Stay. Observation. 8 months of observation. I closed the folder slowly. "Step outside," I told the woman gently. She didn't argue. She walked out, the door closed. Now it was just us and the truth. "There was never cancer," I said quietly. He stared at the floor. "No." "Then what was this?" He inhaled shakily. "I needed capital." Capital. The word tasted metallic. "For what?" I asked. He hesitated. Then he said, "At a private investment." I felt something inside me rearrange. "You faked a life-threatening illness." "For capita, it was temporary," he insisted quickly. "I was going to replace it, multiply it. I just needed time." "How much?" I asked. He whispered the number. It was more than I thought, more than I calculated, because while I was selling jewelry, he had been building something else. "What investment?" I asked. He looked at me finally. "A logistics startup. International shipping model. It's already operational." "Operational. With my money. You forged hospital invoices," I said calmly. He didn't deny it. "You staged overnight monitoring." Silence. "You manipulated insurance." Silence again. "And you found someone else to believe your separation story." He finally snapped. "I did this for us." He shouted. "No. He did it for control, for ego, for ambition, for power, without partnership." I stood up. "You have 30 seconds to tell me everything," I said evenly. "Because after that, I stopped being your wife." He swallowed hard, and for the first time in 8 months, he told the truth. The company was registered 3 months after his diagnosis, under a shell entity, using funds transferred from our joint account. He had been pitching investors, claiming personal hardship story for sympathy leverage. The hospital suite served as a quiet meeting location. The woman I met, daughter of a regional investor, he was courting capital through proximity, while I financed the foundation. I listened without interrupting, because anger is loud, strategy is silent. When he finished, he looked at me as if expecting hysteria. Instead, I smiled slightly. "You think you're the only one who understands investments?" I asked softly. He frowned. That was when he realized he had underestimated me. I left the hospital calmly. I did not cry, I did not scream, I did not confront the other woman. Instead, I went home, opened my laptop, and began reading business filings. Corporate registries. Public records. Shell structures. Debt instruments. Digital paper trails. What Daniel forgot was that before I became his wife, I was an auditor, and auditors do not get emotional. They trace patterns within 48 hours. I found the first crack. The shell entity had one silent co-signer, one overlooked signature line mine from a refinance document he slid into a stack months ago. I remembered signing something quickly between hospital calls. He had buried it, but legally. I owned a percentage. Not small. Controlling. He had needed my credit strength to secure early funding. He thought I would never look. He thought illness would blind me. He thought wrong. I leaned back in my chair, and for the first time since the nurse's sentence, I felt something close to clarity. He did not just fake sickness. He committed financial fraud, forgery, insurance misrepresentation, tax misclassification, investment deception, and he did it publicly. He just didn't know. I had the evidence. Not yet. I closed my laptop slowly. If I confronted him now, he would panic. He would hide assets. He would restructure. No, the mistake he made was thinking I would react emotionally instead. I would react professionally. And professionally, I was far more dangerous. The night I discovered my signature on the cosigner line, I did not confront Daniel. I made him dinner. I asked about his treatment. I kissed his cheek, and I watched him lie without blinking. That was the moment I stopped being his wife and became his audit. Over the next 2 weeks, I played my role perfectly. Concerned, supportive, devoted. I asked gentle questions about his recovery timeline. I encouraged him to focus on the company if that's what gives you strength. I even apologized for being emotionally distant lately. He looked relieved. Men who lie fear chaos. What they never expect is patience at night while he slept. I worked. The logistics startup was called Helixborg Global, registered in Delaware, operating out of a shared office building downtown. 3 listed directors. One was Daniel. The second was a silent investor. The third was me, minority on paper, majority in liability. Exposure. He had used my credit history to secure the initial operating line, which meant one thing. If the company collapsed, I would carry the debt. But if it thrived, I carried leverage. I traced the money. Hospital transfers, joint account withdrawals, shell entity deposits, private equity contributions, and then I found the part that made me sit very still. Helixborg had filed preliminary documentation for a federal shipping contract bid, a government contract. With falsified capital backing, with staged personal hardship narrative in the pitch deck. He had included a slide titled, Founder Resilience Through Terminal Illness. He used cancer as branding. That was when I decided this would not end privately. He was planning a launch. Gala black tie. Investors pressed potential federal contract observers. The theme, resilience and vision. He asked if I would attend. As moral support, he said softly, of course I would. The next morning, I contacted a former colleague. Her name was Meredith Kane, Senior, forensic compliance analyst. We at once dismantled a multi-state fraud ring together. She owed me nothing, but she trusted my instincts. I need discretion, I told her. And documentation, she replied. I sent everything, forged invoices, insurance claims, shell filings, the pitch deck, my forged signature TIME stampies, within 48 hours. She called back. Lara, she said carefully, this is not just fraud. What is it? Wire misrepresentation, insurance fraud, federal contract deception, potential tax evasion. I felt no triumph, just confirmation. What are my options? I asked. You can divorce him, she said, double quotes, no, double quotes, silence on the other end. What do you want? She asked finally. I want exposure. We did not file immediately. Timing matters. If authorities moved too soon, he would suspect me. He would liquidate. He would vanish. No, he needed to feel safe, encouraged, victorious. The gala was scheduled for 4 weeks away. That was our window for the next month. I became his greatest supporter. I attended investor dinners. I smiled for photographs. I nodded during presentations where he spoke about facing mortality. I watched people applaud him for surviving something he never had. He began to glow. Again, healthy, confident, arrogant. The woman from the hospital appeared often. Her name was Camille. She believed she was building a future with him. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost 2 weeks before the gala, I signed a quiet document, a majority control execution clause. Hidden in the refinancing structure he never reviewed carefully. Auditors always read the fine print. Founders rarely do. It granted me conditional operational override in cases of financial misconduct, exposure. He had built his empire on my credibility, and unknowingly, he handed me authority. Meredith coordinated with federal compliance. Quietly, documentation was reviewed, flagged, filed, but no action taken yet. They wanted public confirmation. Evidence presented in operational context. The gala would provide that high profile. Public. Documented speech. False claims repeated live. That was the final trigger. The night before the event, Daniel stood in front of the mirror adjusting his tuxedo. Tomorrow changes everything, he said confidently. Yes, I replied, it does. He kissed my forehead. You believed in me when no one else did. I held his gaze. I believed in what I thought you were. He didn't notice the difference. Gala night arrived. Crystal chandeliers, champagne, towers, camera flashes, media banners, Helix Sports logo projected across a massive stage. The tagline glowed behind him, built through adversity. Irony rarely announces itself so boldly. I wore black, not for mourning, for authority. The ballroom filled quickly, investors seated near the front, contract observers at the side tables, local business press lining the back wall. Daniel stepped onto the stage to applause. He began his speech. Exactly as rehearsed, he spoke about facing death. He spoke about choosing legacy over fear. He spoke about a wife who stood by him. The crowd turned toward me. I smiled politely. He concluded with the line, "When you survive the unimaginable, you build without fear." Applause thundered, and then the ballroom doors opened. Not dramatically, not violently, just precisely. 3 federal compliance officers entered, followed by 2 financial crimes investigators. Their pace was calm, professional. The applause faded into confusion. Daniel's smile froze. They walked directly toward the stage. One of them spoke clearly into the microphone. "Daniel Whitmore." Silence swallowed the room. "Yes," he managed. "We need you to step down from the stage." Murmurs rippled. Cameras pivoted instantly. The officer continued. "You are under investigation for financial misrepresentation, insurance fraud, and federal contract deception." The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, phones raised. Daniel looked into the crowd wildly, searching for me. I did not move. He stepped down slowly, hands trembling. "Lara," he whispered. I walked forward calmly, not to defend him, but to stand beside the officers, and then I spoke, clear, even measured, double quotes. "I would like to formally announce that as majority controlling partner of Helix Sport Global, effective immediately, Daniel Whitmore is suspended from operational authority pending investigation." The room went silent. He stared at me like I had spoken another language. "You? What?" he stammered. I turned slightly toward the investors. "My name is Lara Whitmore, co-founder, majority shareholder, forensic auditor." Gasps again. "I have submitted documentation verifying financial misconduct tied to falsified illness claims and investment deception." Cameras flashed violently. Camille stood frozen near the back. Investors began checking phones. Compliance officers guided Daniel gently but firmly toward the exit. He resisted. "Lara, please." I held his gaze one final time. Calm, unshaken, double quotes you. "Wanted capital," I said softly. "You forgot I was the asset." But it wasn't over yet. Because humiliation is temporary, ownership is permanent, and what happened next would finish it completely. The ballroom did not empty. It fractured. Clusters of investors whispering urgently, phones lighting up like a constellation of panic, press cameras turning from admiration to appetite. Daniel's voice echoed from near the entrance. "This is a misunderstanding. Lara, tell them." But I did not move. I stepped onto the stage instead. Because chaos creates a vacuum, and vacuums need leadership. I adjusted the microphone slowly. "I understand this is unexpected," I began calmly. "Transparency is not optional in federal contracting." Tonight, transparency arrived. A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through the crowd. "I want to assure our investors," I continued, "Helix Sports' operational model remains intact. The misconduct under investigation is tied to personal financial misrepresentation by Mr. Whitmore, not structural viability. That was intentional. I was separating the man from the machine because I intended to keep the machine." An investor in the front row stood up. "You're saying you're majority?" "Yes." "When did that happen?" 3 months ago, I replied evenly, when the capital restructuring was finalized. Daniel had needed emergency liquidity. He never reviewed the governance addendum. He signed under pressure. Men who rush rarely read, auditors always do. Behind me. Federal officers escorted Daniel through the ballroom. Cameras followed like sharks. His face shifted from anger to confusion to realization. He finally understood. The illness lie was not what destroyed him. It was the paperwork. Camille approached the stage slowly once the officers disappeared. Her mascara was smudged, her composure cracked. "You knew," she said quietly. "Yes," I replied. "How long?" "Long enough." She looked toward the exit where Daniel had vanished. "He said you were fragile, emotional, dependent." I held her gaze steadily. "He relied on that." She inhaled sharply. "Is any of this real?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "What part?" "The part where he underestimated the wrong woman." She nodded once, then stepped back. "Some lessons do not need elaboration. Asterisk, asterisk." Within hours, financial news outlets were reporting the investigation. By morning, Helix Sports' valuation dipped. By afternoon, I stabilized it. I issued a formal compliance statement. Suspended discretionary accounts froze, executive access activated. The misconduct clause. Investors appreciate decisiveness more than drama. 3 days later, Daniel was formally charged. Insurance fraud, wire misrepresentation, falsified documentation, tied to medical claims, federal contract deception, attempt. But that still wasn't the ending. The real ending happened a week later. The hospital released internal review findings. He had bribed a low-level administrative coordinator to classify extended observation stays. She confessed. Receipts surfaced, transfer logs matched traced accounts. The narrative he built collapsed completely. He was not a dying visionary. He was a calculated manipulator. And I was no longer the grieving wife. I was the controlling authority. Helix Sports Board convened under emergency governance. I chaired it. Some members expected emotional instability. They found surgical clarity instead. "Do we dissolve?" one asked. "No," I replied. "We restructure." "How?" "We remove personal branding." I deleted the slide titled Founder Resilience, replaced it with audited operational data. We refiled the federal bid with verified numbers. No fabricated illness, no sympathy narrative, just facts. 2 months later, we secured a preliminary contract approval under my leadership. Daniel watched it unfold from pretrial, holding through headlines, through silence. He requested to see me once. I declined. He requested again. I agreed, not for closure, for symmetry. The meeting room was sterile. Metal table. 2 chairs. Security, glass. He looked thinner, not from illness, from consequence. "You destroyed me," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "You miscalculated." He leaned forward. "I built that company with stolen capital," I said evenly. "I was going to repay you. You were going to replace me." Silence filled the room. He finally asked the question he'd been avoiding. "Did you ever love me?" I considered it honestly. "Yes," I said. "And now, I respect myself more." That ended it. The final hearing concluded swiftly. Assets seizure, orders executed, frozen, accounts redistributed under corporate governance. He was barred from executive leadership pending sentencing. Helix Sport was no longer his narrative. It was mine. The night the federal contract confirmation came through, I stood alone in the same ballroom. Empty, silent, the chandeliers off, just me and the stage. I walked up slowly, stood where he once declared survival, and I replayed the nurse's voice in my mind. "His wife is already upstairs." That sentence gave me clarity, but the gala gave me power. People often ask me later how I stayed calm, how I didn't scream, how I didn't collapse. The truth, I did collapse, just privately in my office, in my car, in the shower. But collapse is temporary, control is permanent. 6 months after sentencing, I received a letter from him, handwritten, short. He wrote, "You were always stronger than me. I just needed you small." I folded it once, placed it in a drawer, and never opened it again. Helix Sport grew, not because of revenge, but because of structure. Audits tightened governance, enforced no emotional branding, no martyr mythology, just compliance and execution. Investors trust, stability, stability. Trusts discipline, and discipline begins with boundaries. The last time someone asked about Daniel publicly, it was during a press interview. "Do you regret exposing him?" the journalist asked. I paused only briefly. "No," I said. "Why not?" "Because silence would have made me complicit." The camera zoomed slightly closer. And what did you learn? She pressed. I smiled. That when someone fakes illness to gain capital, I let the sentence hang. Make sure you own the cure. That was the end. Not of him. Of the illusion. He wanted sympathy. I took control. And when the doors opened, he lost the stage.